Good afternoon and welcome to today's Dean Speaker Series on Sustainable Futures. I am Michelle Dinevers. I'm the Executive Director of the Sustainability and Climate Change Office here at Berkeley Haas. And I am thrilled to introduce two of the women leaders whom I most admire. Today's guest speaker in the Dean Speaker Series is Afsaneh Bescholoss. Afsaneh is the founder and the CEO of RockCreek, which is an investment firm among the largest woman-headed investment firms anywhere. Afsaneh has been named among the most powerful women in banking by American Banker, and her firm, RockCreek, manages over $15 billion in assets and believes that integrating inclusion and sustainability from the very beginning is the soundest way to generate long-term value. Prior to starting RockCreek, Afsaneh was a managing director and partner at the Carlyle Group, and before that, she was the treasurer and chief investment officer at the World Bank, which is where we met. Afsaneh and I joined the World Bank in their young professional program at exactly the same time, a few years ago. Early in our careers.
I was going to say, you don't have to say the year.
I'm not going to. You would have thought that I joined a lot sooner, but anyway, we joined at the same time. So Afsaneh has advised governments, central banks, and regulatory agencies on global public policy and financial policy as well as energy. She's actually quite an energy expert. She recently gave a talk as part of the UN climate negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh, where she spoke about accelerating finance towards mitigation and adaptation. Here at Haas, as you know, we are keenly aware of the role of investment in the climate and sustainability transition. In 2008, Haas launched the first student-managed socially responsible investment fund, and today our Sustainable and Impact Finance Initiative is educating the next generation of leaders to utilize finance and investment to drive positive global change. In fact, on March 22nd, 2023, the Sustainable and Impact Finance Initiative is organizing its first inaugural conference on mobilizing climate finance to achieve net zero by 2050. So we are delighted to have Afsaneh with us today to explore these issues. Leading the conversation today is Ann Harrison, the 15th Dean of the Haas School of Business. Ann Harrison is a renowned economist and has dedicated her career to researching inclusive and sustainable policies in development economics, international trade, and global markets. She now brings this focus to higher education here at the greatest public university in the world, go Bears, and the #1 public business school. Ann Harrison also worked at the World Bank, which is also where we met. And so you can see that the World Bank has been a launch pad for powerful women in economics and finance. So please join me in a warm welcome for Afsaneh and Ann Harrison. Thank you.
So I'm going to start out, Afsaneh. Thank you again for joining us today. So you and I, we both started our careers at the World Bank, and now I see that you have founded and are leading a very successful investment management company. I'm leading a top 10 business school. If we look around, we have other former World Bank colleagues who are doing amazing things, also women. So the World Trade Organization is led by a former World Bank woman. The IMF is led by one, the London School of Economics, the Fletcher School. So what is it about the World Bank that really fosters and creates strong women leaders? That's my first question. And then my second question is, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the path that led you from an energy economist at the World Bank to leading the World Bank Treasury to where you are today as the founder of your own firm.
So thank you, Anne, and thank you, Michelle, for your very kind invitation to be together today. It is really seriously a true honor to be on with the two of you and to, be with your great audience of really incredible students. So as Michelle said, we go back a long way, and as Anne said, we have all worked in an institution that you hear about, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. You hear a lot about the bureaucracy, but on the positive side, it's one of the very few places where women have been able to actually just do fine. And in the finance part of the bank, where I worked, as well as energy and other parts on the developments and policy side, where Michelle worked and also Anne worked, we had probably a lot of women role models. I think one of them is that there were other senior women around us. Number two, because we worked in a very diverse environment, you can imagine the World Bank is a very, very global place and very international. And we're all very different with very different backgrounds. Being different was not, did not stand out, let's put it this way. And I think your student body is similarly very diverse. So in my own case, I had my first two, I should say, bosses happened to have been women. It's not like I sought out to work with them, but I worked with Diane Julius, who is very renowned in energy, and Jessica Einhorn, who actually became also afterwards also treasurer of the World Bank and was dean of size, among other people that Anne just mentioned. And it made it sort of possible to think of myself in the same terms. So it was not uncommon for those of us who worked around other women who were, just great in terms of their expertise, but also great in terms of mentoring and sharing that expertise to flourish. The other thing I would say is what Anne just said. I mean, look at what she has done herself. She has had a renowned career before she joined the World Bank, and then at the World Bank, she did an incredible job. But then now in doing this role, which is in education and working at the, I agree with you, the best business school in the world, she is bringing that same energy and dynamic spirit to the men and women of Berkeley House. And similarly, Michelle, who I was very fortunate, I should say. I'm one of three sisters, so is she. And we bonded quickly when we both joined the bank at about the same time, and have commiserated and been excited through our lives about many of our life experiences. So let me just stop there before I go on to sort of how I got into what I got, if I may, Anne. But I don't know if there was anything else on that I could say, or you may want to jump in, or Michelle may want to jump in.
No, we'd just love to hear a little bit about your journey as an entrepreneur now leading the company, RockCreek.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. So very quickly, you asked about the journey a little earlier. I was born in an emerging market, Iran, and I came to the US and when I was 16 as an exchange student, lived in Concord, Mass. And when I was there, I already had an interest in energy because I grew in a country where, which was an oil producer, and had the largest, second largest reserves of natural gas being a big topic these days, of course. And fast forward, I went on to England to do my undergraduate, postgraduate. And when I was at Oxford doing my postgraduate work, I worked with one of my professors, also started the Oxford Energy Institute while I was there. And it was a very oil and gas based place at the time. But his advice to me was a lot of the men know about oil. Very few people are natural gas experts. It's a cleaner fuel. You're starting your life in economics as an economist. Why don't you learn something about cleaner fuels like natural gas? So that was kind of unusual at the time. And it is very similar to all of you who live in the Bay Area, where there's so much venture going on around you, where there's a lot of innovation. So believe it or not, I know it sounds hard to think that natural gas at that time was an innovation to work on. And fast forward, I went to JP Morgan, and did a couple of years there and learned a lot about many of the things that you're learning in your course, like accounting and corporate finance and all those good skills that one needs in order to be able to do other things. Because if you're trained as an economist in England, believe it or not, you don't take any other courses than economics. I was passionate about working on economic development like Michelle and Anne, so I ended up at the World Bank in the Young Professional Program where I met Michelle. And I initially worked on health briefly as a young professional, but energy had been, as I mentioned, something I was very excited about. So I went on to the energy department. And as a young person, I mean, probably not very different in age than some of you, who are listening to us today, I said to my boss, then Deanne Julius, we should really do more on natural gas. And she said, well, why don't you do it? So I went on later on to create this group and brought in everybody from the private sector, because one of the things we've learned is that in order to, there's so much that a multilateral can do, but you really need to leverage its resources if you're going to succeed. Otherwise, the money is not well spent. So we leveraged resources. Every dollar that we brought, the private sector brought $10 because these were good projects at the time. And a lot of them was moving countries away from coal to natural gas. Again, a topic that is very, very topical right now in Europe, in Indonesia, in South Africa, in many other countries. So that was sort of the early story, Anne. And then as solar and wind technologies started to get more developed, we started doing those, and we were pioneering investing in solar and wind. And to be quite honest, they were not quite economic yet. So we got special grants from a lot of the Nordic countries to work on this in a number of countries that were well suited for doing solar and wind. And it was really quite spectacular to be investing in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia, in these cleaner forms of energy in the early days, and doing environmental studies. And a lot of what we're talking about today in terms of impactful investments, we were doing then and trying to do the measurements, because that was the other thing. Are we actually helping, on the environmental side? So some of what we're using today was probably developed at that time with my colleagues and I as we worked on these. So it was a very, very exciting time.
Thank you for that. That's really inspirational to me to hear what a pioneer you are. So I understand. So you were the pioneer to lead the World Bank's investments in clean energy, in wind and solar, with the goal also in infrastructure to reduce emissions. So let's move to right now. Right now, what's exciting to you in climate tech and in renewable energy specifically?
So, Anne, I think a lot of really 2 or 3 areas. One is obviously investing in climate tech in some of the new technologies. And we're doing a fair bit of that. And a lot of that is happening, again, in your zip code, but it's really happening all over the world, including in some emerging markets as well. So we're investing in new technologies that are affecting aviation. I like to call it air, land, and water, because a lot of what we have all worked on traditionally is like on energy, on land, and food and ag. But there's also a lot going on with aviation fuels, and as we speak, we're doing some early investments on alternatives to aviation fuels. There's a lot of work going on water, as you know, because that is such an important source of both resources, but also getting destroyed very fast by many in the world. So we're doing the early stage. Where we also are spending a lot of time, Anne, is also on bringing existing technology on solar, but scaling it. Because as you know, with the new Inflation Act, there's a lot of wind behind investing in cleaner energy. And I think President Biden's efforts to get this as the largest bill that is going to help us moved in this direction is very, very powerful. So what we're doing is to look at specifically scaling solar both residential, but also what we call community, because the community-based solar is very much even more economic, and you sort of bring it into a community rather than individually, which is, as we all know, I don't know if any of you have tried to bring solar power into your own home. There's a shortage of contractors and shortage of experts on this, believe it or not, as we speak. And then also, of course, working on scaling a lot of what is going on the electric vehicles. We're working on that across the board on vehicles as well as larger trucks. So I think both on terms of early tech as well as existing. We're looking at battery storage, of course. That's a very, very big area. Problem with that is that a lot of the new technologies that are going on have still not been incorporated into existing batteries that we're using, and we're looking at that. I think I was looking at some numbers, and just since January 2021, there has been more than close to 100 billion raised for just climate-focused funds from almost 132 firms. So that is sort of a large number. And again, I think given where you're living, you're probably seeing a lot of that going on around you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So now I want to shift a little bit to talking about venture capital. So we know that here in the Bay Area that venture capital has been absolutely critical in the explosive growth of tech. But let's just think about the role of venture capital in a broader sense. We're now thinking about venture capital in many other fields, whether it's agriculture or social impact, for example. So I was just wondering, what do you see as the role of venture capital in sort of the ecosystem in general?
So, Anne, it's really interesting because if you read a lot about venture capital, obviously it's been the fastest growing area of investment in the last few years. And we saw the huge numbers in terms of performance, particularly the last 2 years, the not so good numbers in 2022, which is normal because anything that does incredibly well, like is up 40, 50, 60% in 1 year is not going to continue on that front. But it's still, in my mind, the most exciting because at the end of the day, where returns will come from is innovation. Where returns will come from is how we're going to be living in the future. And again, I think your student body should be telling me what we should be looking at, but it seems to me that the big themes for investors is how do we invest in cheap energy, but cheap energy now happens to be clean energy. So that makes it easier. How do we get sick less? Well, we need cleaner water, better sources of food, and healthier food. So that takes us to food tech, and we're investing in food and ag because there's a lot going on as we speak, not in terms of just producing more, but better quality. And one of the projects we're investing as we speak is also how do you reduce water, for example, and that's with the venture firm because we're looking at almond and pistachios and other goods in California. The company we're investing in is trying to reduce the water need by about 1/3. So venture firms are at the, I think the numbers I've seen is something like about 2 trillion of venture invested so far. I don't know if that number is right or not. Your students and you would know better in the US. And the rest of the world is behind the US, but starting to invest a lot more in Asia. Europe is behind, but trying to do more. And I think that will change over time. But here you are where you're sitting in the middle of the sort of center of innovation, and venture will continue. And as you very correctly said, I really liked what you said, because most people, when they think venture or investing in venture, or a lot of endowments, foundations that you know very well around the Valley, have been investing in tech that is related to software. And I think the future, as we speak, and in the future, and some of what we're doing at RockCreek, is investing. Of course, we'll continue doing that, no question about software, but it's also a lot in the themes of sustainability and impact in health, education, and climate. that will be very exciting.
Thank you. And now let's turn to the company that you founded and that you are heading, RockCreek. So tell us a little bit about major trends and exciting new investment opportunities that you are seeing at RockCreek in venture capital.
So thank you for asking me that. I'm always excited to talk about RockCreek. So I started RockCreek in about 2003, 2004, and we really do two kinds of businesses. One is we will work with endowment foundations, become their chief investment officer, and allocate their assets based on what our views are on the markets, and then choose funds or companies to invest in. Public and private. So all the way from venture, early growth to late stage, early growth and late stage, as well as private equity, real estate, and public markets. On the other side of our business, we're doing direct investments in climate, in food and ag, in health, in education, etc. So those are sort of the two ends, and we're investing very globally, US, Europe, and a lot in emerging markets. So what is interesting, and what I would say, Anne, has changed a lot, is when we started RockCreek, we wanted to do more in impactful investments, but it was sometimes hard to convince our clients, who are endowment foundations, pension plans, about these areas. And something changed just before COVID, and particularly during COVID. And what has been super exciting for me and for our team here at RockCreek is how our clients have basically hired RockCreek because they are excited about these areas, some of the things that you asked me about earlier. So we're getting new clients who are joining us, but very mission-driven, but mission-driven with a return objective. So they're all looking at market returns, and at the same time, they expect to do no damage if they can, and hopefully do some good as far as impactful investments are concerned. I should mention, and also I chaired the investment committee at Rockefeller Foundation, at Doris Duke Foundation, and National Geographic, as well as World Resources Institute. Different in terms of their sustainability goals, but I can tell you that not just in my day job, but in my life as a nonprofit trustee, I'm seeing the same trends as I just mentioned, where a lot of foundations are looking at increasing the share of impactful investments in their total investments. And I don't know how exactly the Berkeley Endowment is managed, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're looking at more impactful investments as well. But I can also talk about some examples if that's of interest.
Well, maybe we can talk about that in the next question. So I wanted to ask a little bit about ESG in particular, right? We all know ESG stands for environmental, social, governance factors in investments, mostly in public markets. So I know that you were an early adopter of ESG investing, and I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit more about the specific framework that you use when you make these investment decisions, since so much can go into an ESG investment portfolio? And also, not just tell us perhaps a little bit about your framework, but also, do you apply that lens to your whole portfolio or just to certain funds?
So Anne, just in terms of history, again, when Michelle and I were at the World Bank, which is a few years before you joined, this word ESG started creeping into our language then. And if you invested in emerging markets, you would know, and both of you know very well, that governance is extremely important. To invest in a company that does not have good governance or is not improving its governance is probably a recipe for a disaster, right? So the G of ESG was very, very big when we started investing. And this is like going back to a long time ago. And then environmental was also early at the bank, as I mentioned, because the bank was getting involved earlier on. Cleaner energy became a big thing. So you would do environmental assessments of your project. And then social indicators were also important in terms of looking at all kinds of health indicators, from child mortality to education and indicators. So all of those, I think the three of us were very fortunate because as those indicators were developed, we were sort of part of the dialogue. And I think you yourself were very involved in that in your time at the bank. So that was sort of historically. And fast forward to today, whole industries are getting developed, and there are many people who are measuring these. And what we decided to do at RockCreek is we realized that there is almost like religion. It's like religious. You cannot get everyone to agree. So there are some people who use one system of ESG. There's Bloomberg, Sustainalytics, there is MSCI, there are many others. And frankly, they lead to very different results. And what we do in RockCreek is we have created like a system that will use any of these external systems, but then we also have our own ratings and try to apply those. And ours are much simpler and more streamlined, I would say. So I think the big issue that you and I were talking about a little earlier about ESG, before we started in the more formal conversation, is that there is a lot of greenwashing going on, and it is reducing the faith of people in the whole subject. And what we need to do is to make it simpler, more easy to adopt, and more easy to regulate, and incorporate it into our daily life. Because I think your students know better than anyone else. You know, they're choosing the place they live, their transport mode, what they're wearing, what they're eating, very much based on environment compared to their parents.
Thank you. I totally agree with you that the systems need to be more streamlined and much more clear and transparent. And so that would be a longer conversation that I'm sure we would all love to have. But in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to a totally different area. So you're the founder and CEO of RockCreek. It's one of the largest diverse-owned investment companies in the world, with over $15 billion in assets under management. Now, if you look at the percentage of minority-owned and women-owned firms in private equity, it is very low, even though it's larger than in all the other asset classes. So there are only 4.5% of minority-owned companies and 1.6% of companies that do private equity are run by women, which is incredible. So you're in that 1.6%. Tell us a little bit about some of the biggest challenges that you faced as an Iranian immigrant woman in setting up your fund.
So first of all, Anne, let me just tell you that one good news, maybe it was the training at the World Bank, was we learned not to take no for an answer. So I think being the word, I think the polite word for it is resilience, is very important. If you're building anything, right? Whether you're building a technical company or you're building an investment firm or anything else. And if you truly believe that what you're doing is something you're excited about, that you're going to do some good, not just for your own team, but for the broader world and the people you're serving, I think it just makes it that much more fun to do, even on days where, it's hard because you go into a meeting and you realize that because you look different, you're not taken as seriously as somebody who looks less different in that environment. I have to tell you that while things have changed and they're a little better today, they're not completely perfect. I would say that even now, even at our size, even though we've been around for a long time, I find that it's still, not as difficult maybe as when I started out, but certainly not as easy as it should be. And one of the things we do at RockCreek, we invest in a lot of new talent. So believe it or not, the first $5 million to a firm called Bridgewater, that a lot of your audience has heard of, came from the team at the World Bank. So we've been early in terms of finding new talent. And new talent could be diverse or not diverse, but 2 or 3 findings that we have. Number one, we did a study with IFC, which looked at private equity and venture investors, and we looked at emerging markets because, believe it or not, again, this data does not exist in the US. You cannot get data on gender or any other kind of diversity from Blackstone or Carlyle or KKR or any of those firms. But IFC required anyone that they invested in to keep this data. So we had data of over 700 firms over 20 years, and sat down with IFC and with Oliver Wyman, went through the data and found the following 3 things. One, and we could only do gender because obviously there's racial diversification since it's all regions in emerging markets. So number one, more women GPs in emerging markets than the US. Number 2, gender balance team. And balance is really important because you want balance, right, in a team. And by that, we meant 30% of one gender represented led to 20% higher return. That's huge. And if you talk to Mary Meeker, who's in the Valley, or any of the other women who have done really well, they will tell you that, having a diverse team means that they look at a broader set of investments and they will question different things. And they will look at risk management differently. So 20% is huge. And then thirdly, if you have a diverse team, like, in this case, it was gender, you're more likely to also invest in underlying women-owned companies. So all in all, I think that was a really interesting result. And we have huge databases at RockCreek that we've been keeping. And what I would love is if you have students who are interested in internships or later on joining, we're looking for really innovative, high energy dynamic students who are interested in looking at this data more intelligently, improving it, and then using it in investment decisions. Because believe it or not, in the venture area, there's very little use of technology per se and data. There's a lot of information on specific industries on data, but looking at trends and using that in investing is not as common. And it's one of the things that we're trying to improve. Last but not least, I'll just say one thing which I think is very positive, which is unlike private equity, as you said, broader category of private investments, where it is very hard to start a new firm, venture is probably one of the easier places to start with a small amount of capital. So if you can raise smaller amounts in venture, which is also an area where you can be very impactful, you can start much more easily. In private equity, if you don't have in buyouts, several billion, you probably won't be taken seriously. And so it's been really exciting for us to do more on the venture side, but I would also let your students know that definitely one of the more open areas for women and men and diverse communities is venture today.
That's really, really wonderful to hear. Students who are here in the room, did you all hear that? There's a real role for a more quantitative approach to venture capital. And here we have the CEO of a big company that's encouraging you to work with RockCreek. So that's great. So I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit more now to the goal to reach net zero emissions globally. What do you see as the role of private companies in catalyzing the transition to net zero emissions and sustainability? And do you feel that the private sector and financial institutions are leading the way or can lead the way to net zero emissions?
So Anne, I find that the interesting thing is that first of all, the audience in your room is the strongest group that is pushing, and it's the new, younger generation that is really pushing the most, and they're the future consumers. So companies are listening to who their existing consumers and the future consumers are. And so they are hearing that they need to be much more impactful and to be much more thoughtful about emissions specifically, which is something which is a little bit easier to measure as they develop their product or as they refine the systems for production of existing goods. So I think that is very much the case. And what you're finding is that some companies, and really the best companies see that it is more cost effective, less risky to move in this direction. And they also don't want to get stuck with stranded assets. So whether they're insurance companies, whether they're financial companies, or they're running other kinds of businesses, they are looking at this much more effectively. In practice, it was only really at the end of last year and the beginning of this year where in the banking sector, if you look at the numbers, just just at banks, the amount going into renewable energy and into traditional oil and gas became equalized. So they're still investing in oil and gas and coal. They have not said they won't. And there was, as you remember, in the last COP meeting in COP26, there was a whole set of financial institutions that signed up for GFANs. But in practice, some have backtracked and some have not done very much on that front. Nonetheless, I think what we need to do is, with the people in the room again and your students at Berkeley and other universities, really improve measurement so that we can hold people responsible and introduce simple rules again to boardrooms to hold their management more responsible. I think we're moving in the right direction. And if anything, I would say the younger people, followed by corporations, followed by governments, and followed by international organizations. So COP is talking a lot, but I wish that they will achieve more and implement more, followed by governments, followed by corporations, and young people would be the direction that you would see more happening versus less.
So that's exciting. There's a real role for our community to really make a difference in this area. So along the lines of disclosure, I want to ask you about a specific proposal. The Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates financial markets, has a proposed climate risk rule that would mandate that companies describe on Form 10K their strategy towards climate risk. And I'm just curious, what do you think about the proposal by the SEC to mandate disclosure in this area?
I think I'm very excited that they're asking for disclosure. I think we were, like many others, involved in giving comments to the SEC. Some of them we saw in their new ruling, some we did not see. But in terms of moving towards more information, I think it's good for investors to see what's a company is doing. Again, if you're investing in a company, you don't want to get stuck with stranded assets in 5 years or 10 years. So it's good risk management to do that. I think the one thing that I would encourage, regulators to do, though, is to be careful, because the larger companies have diversity officers. They have teams of diversity officers. They have teams of impact and sustainability officers. So they can, when they report, they can make a pretty report, let's put it this way, versus other companies who might be much more effective in reducing emissions, but they do not have the impact officers and sustainability officers to produce the beautiful reports. So you need to make the rules to be such that people who are, obviously the Fortune 500 are doing a lot and doing it better, but also smaller companies are also moving in this direction, not just the larger companies. So I would try to simplify. And one other thing is that I think one unintended experience that we've seen is some of the smaller asset management firms who have got dinged by regulators because, again, while they are very impactful, they just don't have the resources to report on it perfectly. And I think you have to be very careful, if I was in the shoes of the regulators, to differentiate between that versus a lot of people who are greenwashing but are very effective in reporting. And I hope that your students are learning the difference between those two, and hopefully with their values will get better reporting in future in companies.
Thank you for that insight on the differential regulatory impacts on large versus small companies. Now I want to ask you a little bit about a backlash against ESG. So we've heard, and I'm guessing that you may have personal experience with this, that some politicians are divesting from companies whom they think aren't investing enough in fossil fuels. So what do you think are the best ways to get critics of ESG investing on board?
This is such an interesting situation right now because you all are in California where, there has been a lot of investment in cleaner fuels and just broadly sustainable energy. And the other states that have been talking about, like you said, and not holding it against the oil and gas industry. I should tell you, I was in one of the most interesting meetings in May of this year in Texas with people who had, roles in universities, very big endowments. They were ex-secretaries of energy from both parties. There were people from all kinds of venues. Anyways, I can't talk about details about that, but let me just tell you that a lot of the biggest CEOs who own oil and gas, their biggest investments now are in renewable energy. So while the politicians in some of these states are talking about oil and gas, in practice, a lot of the business people are investing in renewable energy because that's where they see the future, right? And if anything, they complain about how permitting for renewable energy is slow. I found that really interesting to see the disconnect between the two. And again, I think as the audience for this conversation is thinking about this, what you see is not quite what is happening. And I think what it shows me is that we need a lot more communication between the politicians and the business people from both sides of the aisle, and not being political about it, but being completely businesslike. Solar energy and wind energy. I think Texas is the biggest producer of wind energy, aren't they? You would know better, but they might be ahead of you in California. On solar, they might be number 2. So I think I would look at what the numbers are versus what the politicians are stating.
Thank you. That's brilliant. I think it's so interesting that CEOs in Texas of oil and gas companies are actually putting their bets on wind and energy. That's great to hear. So this is my last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Michelle and those of you in the room who would like to ask questions that maybe I haven't covered. So my last question is, many of our students really are excited about the huge potential of sustainable finance. So we're curious, what do you look for in new hires, other than the fact that you have a Haas MBA, which is an amazing thing? And also, not just what do you look for, but where do you think are some of the really exciting opportunities for our students who may want to have an impact in sustainable finance?
I think this is really the time where, if this is your interest, that is where the largest growth is in terms of jobs, opportunities, and you are very fortunate to be coming out of Haas and with this kind of background. Most companies are looking for young people who have both quantitative skills and qualitative skills, but also have this passion around sustainability. And if you can bring those 3 things together, I think you basically are unique, because there are a lot of people who have qualitative experience around life and some people who have, just quantitative experience. But if you bring the 3, quantitative, qualitative, and sustainability together, I think you are very unique. And whether you're looking at it from again, we talked about venture companies, but the underlying companies that the venture companies are investing in need the same skills, right? And not just the venture firms, but private equity firms are all hiring people. Banks are all hiring people who have this kind of background. And then there's also the nonprofits, and nonprofits are trying to straddle to do more impactful investments with returns in their, not just their endowment, not in their foundation endowment, but also in the rest of their businesses. So you're entering this job market at this very time where certain things are going down, like just pure, you see Amazon letting 10,000 people go off, or Twitter, going through its various interesting changes. And tech in general, when it comes to software, goes through a lot of transition. But the areas we talked about today, sustainability is the growth area. And if you're looking, just go look at the Inflation Act and see where it is driving resources to. And that gives you a really good indication also of where resources are going in the next 5-10 years.
Thank you so much. And now I'm going to let Michelle take over. I think this is a great opportunity. If you have questions, you can go to the mic. And please identify yourselves.
And it's great to be with you and look forward to seeing you soon.
Yes, I look forward to seeing you too.
Thank you so much, Afsaneh. We have students lining up to ask questions, but I'm going to take advantage of my position of standing in front of this microphone to ask the first question. And that is, of your asset owners whose assets you invest, and in your firm, people talk about fossil fuel companies becoming stranded assets. Do you think that your asset owners and other investors actually believe that? Do they actually think we maybe should withdraw from fossil fuel companies because they're going to become stranded? Because one doesn't really see that happening.
So I think there's plenty of people who are invested, as you said, in oil and gas, and particularly natural gas is a very complicated, politically charged question right now, because as Europe is going through its crisis, and they're short of natural gas, the question is, should U.S. and the rest of Europe produce more natural gas, or other places, Africa, to push into replacing the Russian sources in the short run, as Europe is developing its own solar and wind and potentially modular nuclear or other forms of nuclear. So that conversation is very, very hot as we speak. And probably around 10 trillion of investments will go into just Europe over the next decade or so in revamping their whole energy sector, which was very based on, as you know, Russian natural gas. So I think that is a conversation. So the short-term versus the longer-term conversations are really important when it comes to hydrocarbons versus clean energy. And as you see in a lot of developed countries, oil and gas, particularly natural gas, is getting resources. I would say, Michelle, though, that in a lot of oil companies, you'll see that they're renaming themselves, they're changing their names from oil and gas to energy companies, right? And their R&D groups and their groups that are investing in new technologies are increasing and getting more resources. So where you should follow where the money is going in those companies. And I think, more and more you're seeing the money going towards investing in new technologies rather than the old oil and gas. They're not giving up on the existing oil and gas, but they're not spending a lot on exploration production or exploration, really, because some of these, and a lot of the cleaner energy is just cheaper.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. That's really interesting.
It's not just stranded because people believe they should not, use coal or they should not use oil. It's more because, if you get solar that is cheaper, that's where the power generation will come from. That's where the utilities will go to source their energy for power.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I get a different picture reading the FT Energy section. But okay, we have a student. Remember to introduce yourself, please.
Beschloss, a first-year MBA student, and I wanted to ask about nuclear energy. So you mentioned IRA, right? I think there's roughly $500 million earmarked for nuclear energy specifically in the U.S., and I'm wondering what your view is on both fission and fusion's role in the future of energy throughout the world, what we should be doing today, what we've seen with all of the recent investments in fusion over the last 2-3 years, where it's tripled, and just kind of curious what your thoughts are around it.
So I have to tell you, first, my prejudice was not positive about nuclear. I'll tell you what I've learned more recently, and I continue to learn. The reason I was not positive was was around two reasons. One is the waste management aspects that we all know. Where do you keep the waste and how do you deal with the waste? And the other one was, we have seen the accidents around nuclear energy, around locations in Japan or the US or elsewhere where you have very highly skilled technicians. And everything that I learned when I did try to learn about nuclear power plants and went to visit them was the quality of the technical staff who run these. It's not just designing them, but the actual running them is really important. So long as you have high quality trained people to do it, it's fine. And otherwise, it's not fine, and it's very dangerous to the environment around them. And that was why I always felt, since that could not be confirmed, especially if you went out of the G7 countries, the more developed countries, then maybe it's better not to look at it. More recently, we're all hearing about, and some of these IRAs going into what is called modular nuclear, which is smaller. So think of these community solar plants where you get solar plants to go to solar energy for communities. It's similar idea with nuclear, where there is less wastage, there is less possibility of anything dangerous happening. It doesn't need the same kind of technical know-how. There are a few US companies that are developing this technology. They still have not really been used in any scale or anything. So I think we should definitely watch to see how that is going. And I think it will be very interesting, both like you said, to watch the technology on fusion and fission and see what is getting used in scale versus not scale. In terms of the bigger nuclear, as you know, in places like Germany, they had a rule not to touch it. But even there, they're looking at it as one of the many alternatives. So just depends on how fast some of the other things like green hydrogen or other forms of innovation move and how cheap they become. So people will look at the cost of nuclear, which is not cheap, by the way, versus the costs of the renewable energy as is known right now, and new sources of renewable energy that are getting developed. So nuclear, I think, people will continue to look at it, but I think most people still don't want to have the very large-scale nuclear plants next to their houses.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm a second-year MBA. I'm also an exchange student from London Business School. My background has mainly been in the clean energy space from a financial advisory point of view. Thank you for your talk today. My question was around the investment side in terms of ESG integration. So I think we've talked about particularly how ESG factors into selecting these investments. So we've talked about accelerating the renewable energy space and other clean tech. I guess on the other side of ESG integration, beyond impact measurement, we're talking about like adding value. Could you talk to a few examples where your fund has added value from an ESG perspective, particularly maybe later stage, kind of more akin to like private equity?
I mean, one of the things we look at in all of these is obviously looking at if it's a clean energy technology or if it's a renewable source of energy. Obviously, we look at the carbon emissions, and that is sort of I don't want to say straightforward, but a little bit easier to measure, right? I think the other things in terms of value that are harder to measure is, let's say, job creation, right? How many jobs have we created? And for some of our clients, that really matters. So in terms of value, what are you adding beyond the emissions? And there we do measure if we are creating new jobs that did not exist before, what kind of training programs we are providing. So I think that is important. We look at the value if some of the places where we're investing is more economically backward areas that do not have the same, situation as others. We're looking at some solar plants as we speak in Georgia and elsewhere on blighted agricultural land where there is no alternative to either using it for agriculture or anything else. And as solar comes in, it will really reduce energy costs for population that it will make, it will be meaningful, as well as using this land that it could not have been used. So those are some of the places, but I'm not sure if that's answering your question exactly.
Yeah, I think it does answer to some extent. So it sounds like it's mainly impact measurement, tracking, and then kind of socially in terms of increasing jobs and reporting on that.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Afsaneh. Thank you so much for coming to guest speak for us at Haas. I'm Jennifer Yan. I'm a senior undergrad student here. And I have two questions. So first one, what do you think as the end goal of ESG? Basically, how does it play out in maybe 10 or 20 years in the US or in developing countries? I think second question is, you mentioned about addressing the greenwashing issues about some like ESG funds. And what do you think are some good criterions that come into the ESG investment process that make sure that our investments are actually making the impact that we want? Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for these great questions. I'll tell you my hope and dream is that we won't have these terms like ESG, that you and your friends in your class and others in your position will make sure that everything we're doing is good for the environment. It's got good governance. It's, you are running diverse boards, diverse companies, and you're trying to not, when I look at S, for example, we're in a very highly inflationary environment right now, right? Every time you open the newspapers, people will say, oh, wages are going up. By the way, we know that wages have gone up a lot less than inflation has in the last 12 months, right? But they will talk about how the labor market is tight, and as wages go up, that will be highly inflationary. However, there is another scenario where you say, well, wages could go up a little bit more, at least to meet inflation, but profits could come down. It means that some of the stakeholders will make less money, i.e. the shareholders in the company, but they'll still make profit. The labor will get paid a more decent wage. And as you're coming out of this inflationary period, actually they won't be hit with big debt and they will consume more, which means we will have more economic growth. And so when we talk about the S, to me, it's a very practical, real thing, And so when I hear many economists talking about wages creating inflationist spiral, but they don't talk about profit margins, I think there's something wrong in that conversation, because all of these end up, to be inflationary. And you have to have productivity, capital, labor, and technology, and all these other costs and profit margins all look at it as one, not individually. So the reason I say that is I think we're still sort of moving out of a world where having a decent wage was not something that people thought about. And I think as we move to a world where people believe in truly paying people a decent wage and to have, your environment be everywhere, be the environment you want around yourself, where you're breathing air, and you have clean water to drink for everybody. And you have good governance, i.e. hire people like you and me and others in your audience, then I think companies will not hopefully use the term ESG. So I'm sorry to be a little long-winded on that, but hopefully the term ESG will go away because we don't need it. That would be if we're really successful. And it sort of brings you to the greenwashing subject, and I'll be faster on that, because I think on the greenwashing, I think you just have to hold people up to what they're doing. And the more you can measure what is getting done versus their reports, and holding people responsible to a few factors. What did you do for emissions yourself in your own company? What did you do on diversity internally? What did you do on, but specifically with greenwashing, which is about the environment, the 2 or 3 factors that are important on the environmental side, holding them responsible, I think will be the best way to deal with that, versus letting them just say we are moving towards improving, our emissions, which is just too fuzzy. So I think that would be my answer.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Do we have one more question? Do you have time, Afsaneh, for one more question?
I can do one more question, okay. Yes, if there is one more.
There is.
Hello, my name is Joseph. I'm a second-year MBA. I have a question about kind of managing VC expectations. So climate tech startups have different looking economies of scale, different looking economics than tech companies, but there has been so much tech and VC relation that's been going on. As a climate tech startup, how should you manage those VC expectations a little bit differently, given that you're going to have higher capital costs than a more traditional software-based tech startup?
I think it's a great question. I think that is why there are a lot of climate tech venture firms that are getting created that are specializing just in climate tech. So I think they obviously will be much more sensitive to what you're saying versus the more general venture firms that are investing across the board and they're looking at everything at the same time. So obviously the two will look at the cost of capital differently, right? Because if you're investing in climate tech, you're looking across different investments across that sector and looking at what is sort of your best ideas. The other thing is that if you look at the other companies, you know, the broader, larger venture firms that invest across areas, they already have a lot in software, right? So they're trying to diversify. No question they'll look at the cost of capital, but, and there's, in general, cost of capital has gone up from zero, so there's that issue, which is affecting everything. But I think, I don't think that will be the issue in terms of investing in climate, just because they also see where money is going and they will follow money. So.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, for your questions. And Afsaneh, thank you so much for joining us today. I know that there's a huge amount of appreciation among our students. I expect to see you flooded with letters saying, how can I come work for you? Sounds like such an interesting firm. So thank you very much. We really appreciated having you with us.
Thank you, Michelle. Really, really great to be with you.